Since we are right at 7:30, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get started. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk specifically about migration patterns, maps, and trails of the 17th through the 19th century. I am going to talk about a few that spill over into the 20th century, but for the most part, we're really talking about, post-Revolutionary War period until about 1870. So up until, I'll go back one page. So up until about the time of the Revolutionary War, up until the late, 1760s and the 1770s, most of colonists, most of the people in the United States, well, the colonies at the time, lived within 50 miles of the eastern seaboard, just because it was easier to get to and from other cities, other large cities. It was faster to take a boat than it was to try to go overland. So when you look at this map that's provided by National Geographic, it really gives you an idea that even up until the Revolutionary War, there really weren't a lot of people that were pushing even to the Appalachians. So what you're looking at are those little inroads, those inlets that you see up into New York and into parts of Pennsylvania were really largely based on either river transportation or boat transportation along the eastern seaboard. You don't start to see that change until about the 1750s. And I'll talk about plank roads and I'll talk about wagon roads in just a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about rivers and canals first. So even though this map is from 1885, it's a map that's available on the Library of Congress website. This kind of shows you all of the different waterways that were available even up until the mid-1880s. So all of these little inlets, we're talking about not only major rivers, but we're also talking about canals. We're talking about sea lanes and things like that to really transport people across the country. Up until the Civil War, we're talking the eastern half of the country, because even though you still had people who were moving west, people who were using the Oregon Trail, people who were using the Santa Fe Trail, and I'll talk about those a little later on. Canal building was really largely just an eastern United States phenomenon. You don't really see canals that are spreading west of the Mississippi. So as the key source of travel, you're also at the mercy of the river. So you had a lot of places where people had to ford the river and carry their goods for a period of time before the river became deep enough again that they could continue on their route. So the use of rivers were only good if the weather was good. If you had flooding, if you had rapids, then you would have to come out of the river, you'd have to carry your goods across land, and then you would have to get back in the river. So that's why so many settlers lived nearby the rivers or the eastern seaboard, because there were spots of the country, the Potomac River is a good example, where it just was too shallow or it was just too dangerous to take river transportation past that point. So it's not until after the Revolutionary War that you really start to see people solving this problem in a number of interesting ways through the utilization of Native American trails and turning them into wagon trails. They're really taking advantage of canals where they're digging their own canal systems in order to speed up the process of transporting people and goods. In the 1790s forward, you get the use of paid turnpikes, where you would have private companies who were maintaining roads that were charging a fee in between toll booths to get people to and from different parts along the eastern seaboard. So as people expand, as people start moving westward, as the population of the United States increases, they get more inventive in how they're going to move these peoples and these goods. The invention of the steamboat was a huge success after 1811 because it was really responsible for being able to move people and move goods very quickly. And when you think about it, after the Revolutionary War, right before the Revolutionary War, as people are starting to move west, they're cutting through the Cumberland Gap, they're moving west past the Appalachian Mountains into Kentucky and into Tennessee. they're not really moving a lot further than that. Up until 1804, until the United States purchases the Louisiana Purchase and takes over a huge swath of the United States west of the Mississippi, people are kind of stopping along the Mississippi River. It's not until after that that you start to see this big push. Lewis and Clark, who are mapping and giving, good visual descriptions on what the land is like, how easy, can they navigate the rivers and streams west of the Mississippi, that you start to see people pushing west of the Mississippi River. But even then, they're not going much further west. They're staying, St. Louis, they're staying in, Omaha and in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So they're really not branching too much further west for a number of years. So the invention of the canals was actually kind of ingenious. So the canal is a dedicated, a dug out system of transportation to move goods by bodies of water between rivers. So, these are man-made, these are dug with labor, who are then putting in a series of locks to fix the elevation issues that they're having with creating these bodies of water between rivers. And I'll talk about the I&M Canal in just a couple of minutes. But if you think about the I&M Canal, if you've ever, walked along the trail between Lockport and Channahon, then you've seen the locks firsthand. And this really was incredibly inventive. Now, it wasn't designed, it wasn't invented in the United States. These go back to Leonardo da Vinci in the 17th century, who are creating the first canals. But it's really impressive at the scale in which they used canals within the United States along that eastern seaboard. So the first canal to open, the Erie Canal, opened to wild success in 1825. And I'm kind of working myself a little bit out of order talking about canals and rivers, because the Erie Canal actually follows the exact same route, almost the exact same route that the Mohawk Turnpike followed, and that was opened in 1800. So it's this evolutionary process. So the canal was really a great example of ingenuity to be able to take the Mohawk Turnpike, the paid feed travel route that you would follow overland, dig the canal, be able to then move that transport, all of that equipment, all of those goods, all of those people at twice the speed as doing it overland. But I don't want to discredit the importance of overland routes, and I'm going to talk about those in just a few minutes. Interestingly enough, Pennsylvania had the largest number of canals. They had almost 1,000 canals in the state of Pennsylvania between the 1820s into the 1880s. Most canals had a tendency to die out by the late 1800s. I'll give you an example. I lived in Washington, D.C. I went to graduate school there, and the Potomac Canal that goes right through the southern end of Georgetown, really by 1885 had been abandoned for a variety of different reasons, largely because of railroad transportation, once again, hastened that ability to transport people and the ability to transport goods at twice the speed. So we're doubling as we go along, from the Native American trails to the wagon roads to the canals to the railroads, then to automobiles eventually later on. But there's a great wiki page that's out there that lists all of the canals in the United States. There was even one in Illinois that I had completely forgotten about. I had forgotten about the Chain of Rocks Canal that heads into St. Louis. So it's a really nice inventory of the types of canals that existed at that time. And what's so important about these is because it really helps you understand the time period that your family is migrating from one part of the country to another is largely going to be dictated by what mode of transportation they could use to get there. So when I talk about the Mohawk Trail in just a second, I have to think about how that impacted my family. So in the 1840s, my family is living in Schenectady, New York. The Erie Canal opens a generation before that. Did my family take the Mohawk Turnpike? Or did they take the Erie Canal when they moved from Schenectady to Oswego, New York in 1840? So following what would have been the most popular form of transportation, what would have been the most common route, or in a lot of cases, the only route to get from one part of the country to another. It's going to help you understand why they went and how they got there and what life was like along that trail as they were on their way. So some great resources that I want to mention. In your handout, you've got a ton of links available. So when you registered, if you took the opportunity to download the handout that I made available, if you've ever used JSTOR, there are a lot of really, really good articles that were published in JSTOR at the turn of the 20th century, between 1900 and 1915, that spend a considerable amount of time and give some incredibly useful primary sources talking about post roads, King's roads and Queen's roads, the rivers and the canals. And luckily for us, if you don't have a subscription to JSTOR, if you go out to Internet Archive, that front list where they show you the most popular collections, if you scroll down about 2/3 of the way down that page, there is a collection of historic JSTOR articles that are available through Internet Archive for free, where you can find a lot of these scholarly, well-documented articles in well-known journals. Even the Illinois Historical Society Journal is in there. You've got the National Historical Societies that are in there as well, that are writing these articles talking about the foundations of these roads, how they were built, the numbers of people who traveled along them, and just the history of these in general. So Internet Archive is a great resource for that. A couple of other really fantastic resources for digging deeper into what life was like and what migrations and travel patterns were like in that colonial era, using rivers, using canals, using turnpikes, using wagon roads, are the National Archives and the Library of Congress. So a lot of the maps that I'm going to show you today are maps that came directly out of the Library of Congress's map collections. All of these are available for you to utilize in your own research. And the National Archives has digitized quite a lot of primary resources related to post roads and wagon roads and things like that. So a lot of those are in your handout already. But it's a great thing to keep in mind as I'm talking, and I'm kind of giving you a rundown about the types of routes that people would have taken. You're really going to do that digging through those three main sources. You're going to use Library of Congress, you're going to use National Archives, take a look at Internet Archives, and go through those JSTOR journals that are available to you. So even though this map is a railroad map that dates to 1834, and you could see the railroads are in their infancy at this point. So there's not a whole lot of railroad transportation in the U.S. at this point. But what is fascinating about this map, and again, this is another one of those maps that's available through the Library of Congress, all along its borders, they're showing you the canal routes. So you can only see a tiny little piece of this in this bottom corner here. You can see the Pennsylvania Canal, you can see the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, and they're kind of giving you the elevations of the canal. They're giving you the nearby ports and cities along the way. So it's really a great opportunity to see what was going on in 1834 in this, canal building process that was taking place. So this is a zoom in of another set of canal details that are listed on this railroad map. But you've got the Schuylkill Navigational Canal, Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, Union Canal, and they're kind of giving you that information. So if you have family, who wound up in Harrisburg and you're not quite sure exactly why, it's on the canal route. So it's very possible that they had come there and stopped there because they were traveling along the canal. So looking at maps, and this is true whether you're looking at, 1760 transportation routes or whether you are looking at 1960 transportation routes, you want to make sure that you're focusing on maps that are pertinent to the period that you're doing your research. And many of you have heard me lecture on maps before, and I kind of beat on this a little bit in my lectures, because it doesn't do you a lot of good to try to figure out why your family wound up in Albion, Iowa, which is now a ghost town, if you're looking at a 1975 map of Iowa instead of looking at an 1875 map of Iowa. And when I talk about railroads, I'll talk a little bit more about Albion. But when you can't figure out what happens to a town, why it disappears, why it springs up in the first place. It's really, really important that you're looking at maps that are pertinent to the time period. So this railroad map in 1834, even though it's highlighting the railroad routes, they're still acknowledging the fact that canal transportation is widely popular and is rapidly expanding along the eastern seaboard at this time. So what about the Illinois-Michigan Canal? I mentioned, taking a look at the locks, between Lockport and Channahon. What's interesting to note about the I&M Canal is that it started and stopped multiple times. So it wasn't actually completed until 1848. It was originally started, in the early 1820s. It wound up going bankrupt in 1826, which halted construction for an entire decade. It wasn't until 1836 that Illinois and Congress were able to come to an agreement to then begin the digging and the building of the canal. So I don't know if any of you have ever traveled the route of the canal, but it starts in my community, in my neighborhood where I grew up. I grew up in Bridgeport on the south side. So Bridgeport is just that, it's the start of, the canal in Chicago, and travels all the way down to Peru, LaSalle, Peru, and LaSalle County. So all of the people who worked along the canal, who for a decade, a little bit more than a decade, were responsible for doing the digging and building the locks and surveying the land, were paid, but a lot of them were also paid in what were called canal lots. So there are neighborhoods in Lockport that were originally known as, canal lots, as canal neighborhoods, because those were land that were given directly to the canal workers as payment for the work that they did on the canal. A lot of these records exist. You can find them at the Will County Historical Society. They just found a cache of canal records that hadn't been accessioned, that had been donated. It was just in this last issue of the Illinois State Genealogical Society Quarterly. Thanks for Deb Dudak for writing that magnificent article. But Lewis University has had an I&M Canal connection for decades. So in the Lamb collection, he did a lot of research and collected a lot of documents on the building and the maintenance of the I&M Canal. So you can find records at Lewis University. Many of them are digitized. A bunch of them are available through Carly that you can view digitally online. The Illinois State Historical Society has some information. The Illinois State Archives has a collection. They have a teacher's packet up on Cyber Drive, Illinois, with some original documents from the construction of the I&M Canal as well. But really, the I&M Canal opened up a huge part of northern Illinois. So when people think of the canal in the 21st century, they think of the canal as being from Chicago to LaSalle. It was actually the opposite. So Illinois, like a glass of water, filled from the bottom up along the rivers and streams, starting in southern Illinois and working its way north. So in Illinois, Ottawa was a much bigger city in 1826 when the original canal was patented than the city of Chicago was. Chicago didn't really exist yet. It was still just Fort Dearborn. So what's interesting to know is that it's moving goods and people north from LaSalle to Chicago, not the other way around. We kind of forget that in the 21st century, that it's moving people up, LaSalle to Lockport, Joliet, Lamont, and moving people in closer to the city as the state of Illinois fills up north. People are moving along the canal, moving goods along the canal, both south to Ottawa to trade and to sell, as well as north to Chicago to sell and trade as well. So it's an important detail to remember that looking at Illinois settlement patterns, it's important to note that, Chicago was just a barely fledgling city in the 1830s and early 1840s, that Ottawa was actually really the powerhouse in all of this, and even Joliet to an extent, and Lockport. So there are records available on the I&M Canal. There are some fascinating things that you can find digitally already available while we're still sheltering in place. To dig a little bit deeper, if you had family members, largely Irish, but not only Irish, who worked for the I&M Canal, those are the three main places where I would go to look for that information. So here's a couple of maps for you. This kind of shows you the route of the Illinois-Michigan Canal. You can kind of see where it starts in LaSalle, Peru, runs through Ottawa, runs through Morris, Seneca, Channahon, Joliet, Lockport, Lamont, on its way into Chicago. The one that I'm showing you here, this 1883 map, O.W. Gray and Sons map of Bridgeport. This is just a cropped image of the entire neighborhood of the ward, but you can kind of see, where the canal starts, past Bubbly Creek, where it kind of dumps into the Chicago River. But the I&M Canal isn't the only river. So while most canals are really petering out by the 1880s, and the same is true for the I&M Canal, canals around the city of Chicago are still being built well into the 20th century. So you have to look at things like the Cal Sag, which was built between 1911 and 1922. You have to look at things like the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, which was built started in 1900. Their main goal, what you see between those two canals is largely to connect transportation between the Chicago River, the Des Plaines River, and the Calumet River. So while goods and transportation are coming into Chicago following the Great Lakes, and they're traveling down the Chicago River, they kind of hit a dead end if they're not taking the I&M Canal. And once the I&M Canal kind of goes out of business, they have to start creating other ways to transport goods around. So the Cal Sag and the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal are both built after 1900. So while most other canals are going out of business in and around Chicago, those are becoming a really important mode of transportation. And you still have barges that kind of go back and forth along the Cal Sag and the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. The Southeast Chicago Historical Society has a fantastic collection of information about these two canals. So that's something to really keep in mind too. If you have family that maybe worked along one of these two canals, Southeast Chicago Historical Society would be a wonderful place to go to dig a little deeper on that subject. But they were a huge, important part of transportation here in and around Chicago. So I want to backtrack just a little bit to talk about post roads and wagon roads. So the earliest roads, post roads, were called King's Highways. And those were really early routes that were carved out using Native American trails. I'll talk in just a minute about Braddock's Road, that's exactly what happened. Even in Illinois, it's the exact same thing. You have people who are using Sauk Trail, which I've driven on multiple times. Over the last decade, anytime I'm heading towards, the south side of Chicago, or I'm heading in Indiana, I'll drive on Sauk Trail. And that's exactly where it gets its name, because it was the Native American Sauk Trail that they would use to hunt and to travel. So these connected settlements, but most of the time, a lot of these routes were no longer than 12 or 13 miles long. They're just connecting city to city. There's very few exceptions where they're much, much longer routes. One of those longer routes, one of those King's Highways, if you've ever traveled on I-95 in Virginia, the King's Highway was designed to get people back and forth during the colonial era between the city of Alexandria and the city of Williamsburg. So if you traveled on I-95 and you've sat in traffic between Richmond and Washington, D.C., like all of us have at one time or another, those are really built on that original King's Highway that was connecting Alexandria, Virginia, and Williamsburg. And you'll see them up and down the Eastern Seaboard, and they were all maintained and run and provided by, the governors who were responsible for their territories, for their colonies. And it was the main route of getting information, back and forth throughout the colonies. The Boston Post Road is one of the most famous. It's one of the earliest highways that was created between 1673 and 1678. It's going between Providence and New York. The problem with the Boston Post Road, and if any of you have kind of traveled it in modern days, their markers are not very well designated. And that was a huge problem that people who were traveling along the post roads and wagon roads had is that it would be very, very easy to lose the trail and wind up off course. They weren't very well marked. They weren't very well defined because very, very few people were traveling great distances. Most people were staying nearby and visiting nearby communities. They weren't taking those huge trips. So if you think about how far it is from Alexandria to Williamsburg, by car right now, you're looking at 3.5 to 4 hours. So you're talking days if you were going to do that in 1673. So these weren't always very well defined. You would have problems in the winter and in the summer with bad weather, whether it was, washouts because of the rain or whether it was deep snow in the winter, which is why so many people relied on, seaport travel, because it was easier to travel and faster to travel that way. The Albany Post Road is another one that went from New York City. It began in 1693. It was open to all transportation, so not just official government business, in 1703. So it's often called Queen's Road, named after Queen Anne, because she was regent at that particular point in time. After William and Mary, Queen Anne becomes queen. And when this road is opened to public transportation, it's named after her. So Braddock's Road, which I alluded to a little earlier, Braddock's Road is a fascinating little piece of history there. So if you've ever traveled from Maryland up into the Pittsburgh area, you've most likely traveled on the descendant of Braddock's Road. Now, it was originally traced by George Washington himself. So this is before he becomes lieutenant colonel, but this is actually how he winds up getting his promotion. So he kind of, in the Army, becomes a de facto agent for the Ohio Company in 1753. So George Washington's job is to figure out a route to get from Fort Cumberland, which is in the process of being built at this time, to get from Fort Cumberland up to Duquesne, where there's a French fort near Pittsburgh. So while there are Native American trails and there are French trails, George Washington's task is to find a better way, find a smoother route so that they can take those old Native American trails and turn them into a wagon trail. So Edward Braddock, a couple of years after, George Washington goes and traces this route that he feels is the best, the smoothest route to create a wagon road for getting British troops as well as British supplies, colonial troops and supplies up into the Pittsburgh area, up into Washington County. Braddock is the one that really starts the construction. So it's named after Edward Braddock. But this road at its widest is 12 feet. And when you think about that, it's really not that big. It's a one-lane road. But at the time, you're talking about all of these men having to cut down these trees and create this road, sheerly with manpower. They don't have heavy equipment to do this. They're doing this with hand tools. So a 12-foot road, really is quite a phenomenon at this time. And when you look at wagon roads, like I said, and when you look at post roads in the colonial era, they're really just short 10 to 12 to 13 mile routes, because think of the manpower and the effort that needed to go into building these. So Braddock's Road was really a huge accomplishment, but it was really for monetary gain. It was really a way for the English to get a foothold into the fur trade, because at this time, they're paying twice as much to buy furs from Native American tribes than the French, because the French kind of have, a monopoly on what's going on, because the French have been there, since the, early 1600s. So they have these routes, they have these connections already in place. And the British are trying to kind of cut in and take a little piece of that action. So it was really for economic reasons, more so than it was for military reasons. But, a lot of this did wind up causing the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War because of that fighting, and those inroads that are being made at this time. So if you've traveled along Braddock's Road in modern times, the equivalent would be traveling along US Highway 40 up into Pittsburgh from Cumberland, Maryland. So the Great Valley Road, now that's how my family traveled in colonial times. So the Great Valley Road So I have ancestors who are Covenanters, and Presbyterian Covenanters, slowly moved west from 1680 when they came to America and landed in Philadelphia until they wound up in the Pittsburgh, Washington County area by 1750, let's say. So as each generation passes, they slowly move a little bit further west, and then they feel like, wait, this has gotten way too crowded. There's a falling out with Covenanter Presbyterians, and a large group of them decide that they're going to travel south along the Great Valley Road. So a lot of your ancestors might have done this as well. If they were in Pennsylvania and New York, and then a generation later, you all of a sudden find them in, Charlotte, North Carolina, this is how they got there. So they're taking the Great Valley Road from right around Gettysburg south along the Appalachian Mountains. They're skirting the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains. They're moving south through like the Cowpens River area down into Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. So this was a very major route between 1720 and 1760, give or take. You can kind of see it in this image. You can see how it's coming down out of Chambersburg, out of the Gettysburg area. It's coming down past Winchester, past Roanoke. A lot of people for 5 or 6 years in the 1750s had settled between Stanton and Roanoke in that Cowpens River Valley area until the Indian Wars, so to speak. That's when a bunch of them felt that it was just too unsafe and began that push further south from Roanoke down into Charlotte and into Mecklenburg, into Winston-Salem, and into Greensboro. What's interesting to note about these wagon roads and these valley roads is that right at Roanoke, you'll see that the Great Valley Road meets up with the Wilderness Road. And I'll talk about the Wilderness Road in just a second. And the Wilderness Road is really the southern route that starts pushing people, at the time of the Revolution and immediately after the Revolution, west of the Appalachian Mountains into Kentucky and into Tennessee. But the Great Valley Road, if you had ancestors in, like I said, you had them in Pennsylvania, or you had them in Maryland, and all of a sudden a generation later, right about the time of the Revolutionary War, they're showing up in Charlotte, this is how they would have gotten there. There's a fantastic collection. So once on the next slide, when I start talking about the Wilderness Road and I start talking about that push into Kentucky and Tennessee, there's a fantastic map collection in the Library of Congress. I give you the link here. It's in your handout on really early Kentucky maps, almost by year. You see, 1790, 92, 95, 97, 1800, 1802. So you really get to see how Kentucky and Tennessee kind of explode after the Revolutionary War by using these collections that they have at the Library of Congress. So here's another example. Here's where they meet up. So those people who are coming down the Great Valley Road are colliding with the Warrior's Path, are colliding with the Wilderness Road and beginning to head west of the Appalachia into places like Tennessee and Kentucky. So this is just a very small portion of a much larger map. You can see the link is here for you. It's in your handout as well. But you see all these little towns, in the late 1750s and 1800s that might not still be there on a map in 1900 or in 1950. So using these maps pertinent to the time will really give you an understanding of what was going on and how people were moving. Jefferson was a very huge fan of the Natural Bridge. He wrote about it a lot. It's not that far from Charlottesville, and it's shown on this map right above the arrow on the right as well. So I want to talk for just a second about turnpikes, because turnpikes feed into this notion of the Cumberland Road to the Warrior's Path in the Wilderness Trail. So like I said, turnpikes are predating canals. You see your first turnpikes springing up immediately after the Revolutionary War. You see them 1792, 1797. We're still Continental Congress. We're not really a United States in a lot of regards, as these first turnpikes are starting to get started. By 1792, yes, we're the United States of America. And these turnpikes, are given to companies like I talked about, the Ohio company that George Washington was kind of a de facto agent for, to find the the best routes. But these were privately owned companies who were making a profit on people traveling, between, Provincetown and Boston, people who were traveling between Albany and Schenectady, and then from Albany out to Utica, and then out to Oswego and places like that. So these turnpikes were really, really important. But turnpikes then get beat out, like I said, by canals. So turnpikes are popular for about 20 years. The Erie Canal follows almost, like I said, almost the exact same route as the Genovese Trail, as the Mohawk Turnpike. And then eventually, when the Erie Canal runs its course and is no longer profitable, it's replaced by the New York Central Railway. So all of these things, you can kind of follow this progression of transportation, from the turnpikes and the wagon roads to the canals to railroad transportation, and then eventually to the automobile as well. So the Cumberland Road, what we know of, as I mentioned, the Warrior's Path, when I talk about passing through the Cumberland Gap, that southern route to get into Kentucky and Tennessee, that was originally a turnpike that went between Cumberland and Baltimore, Maryland. So where Cumberland Road comes into Cumberland, that turnpike ran from Cumberland into Baltimore, and people were tolled roughly every 20 miles in between. So if you've taken like the Frederick Turnpike, for example, if you've ever traveled, from Ohio through Maryland down into Washington, D.C., you might have traveled along Route 144, which would be the modern day version of the Frederick Turnpike through Frederick, Maryland, which isn't too terribly far from Harper's Ferry. William Dollarhide's book, if you haven't already read it, if you don't own a copy of it, it's really not that long. It's like 48 pages long, but he gives a really succinct synopsis of early migration routes in the colonies and the early period of the United States, up until about 1820, 1830. And this is a map that he includes in his book. And he includes it in his book because he wants to illustrate how people are traveling west after the Revolutionary War and why they're traveling west after the Revolutionary War. So we all know that people were given land bounty warrants if they served in the Revolution, and they could use that to then buy land west of the Appalachian Mountains. But how were they going to get there? So I kind of highlighted the Warrior's Path. The Cumberland route is the southern route that led into Kentucky through the Cumberland Gap. I'll talk about the National Road in just a couple of minutes, which went, east from New York and Pennsylvania across Ohio into Illinois. But then the northern routes as well. When we're talking about the Erie Canal and we're talking about river transportation and we're talking about transport along the Great Lakes, a lot of people traveled the northern route too. Some even came through Canada, went through Hamilton, Canada, went through Toronto, traveled the Great Lakes to get to Detroit, and then south to get to Chicago, and then traveled west. So you really have to look at the time period that your family is traveling and why they're traveling. So, for example, if you look at this map, they're talking about the states that are ceding land to the states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. So Virginia gives up the land to become Kentucky in 1792. North Carolina gives up the land to become Tennessee in 1790. Georgia gives up their land to eventually become the Alabama and Mississippi Territory, to become those states in 1802. The Northwest Territory, Dave McDonald gives some amazing lectures if you've had the pleasure to hear him. Thomas Jones also gives some great presentations about the Northwest Territory, about those people who are moving into Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan at this particular time. Indiana's not founded until 1816. Illinois doesn't become a state until 1818. We're still territories at this particular time. But what I like to point out is the fact that where we're sitting in our living rooms right now was the state of Virginia at one time. It was southern Wisconsin at another time. So it's important to keep in mind where we are right now is also impacted by how people traveled to this part of the country. And for us, for many of us, it was the Great Lakes. If we came after 1840, if you came to Illinois before 1840, remember, like I said, Illinois settled from the bottom up. So you're either coming west across the Cumberland Gap, coming through that Warrior's Path, or you're coming along the Ohio River. You're coming across that national road, which is open to the public in 1806. So depending on when you came to Illinois, when your ancestors came to Illinois, you're going to choose most likely one of these three routes. So I want to talk about the national road, the Cumberland Road, for just a second. So the Cumberland Road took an entire generation to be completed. So the original design was to go from Cumberland, Maryland to Terre Haute, Indiana. They increased that and made it go all the way to Vandalia in southern Illinois. And then eventually it pushed even further all the way to St. Louis, to Alton and St. Louis. So again, after the Revolutionary War, people are being given land bounty warrants. They're traveling either the Warrior's Path or they're beginning to travel along the Cumberland Road. Those are the true routes that they most likely would have taken if they had settled in southern Indiana, southern Ohio, or southern Illinois. And to give you an example of this, so like I said, my Presbyterians who traveled south from Philadelphia area, from Gettysburg, from Pittsburgh, wound up in Mecklenburg at the time of the Revolutionary War. Within a generation, they're in South Carolina because they had been given land just across the border into northern South Carolina. By the 1820s and 1830s, they're staunch abolitionists, and they're really, really pushing back against the idea of slavery. So whole congregations, whole Presbyterian congregations are picking up and they're moving along the national road. They're traveling along the Ohio River, and they're taking the names of those communities in South Carolina, and they're dotting southern Ohio, southern Indiana, and southern Illinois with them. Chester, South Carolina becomes Chester, Indiana, which becomes Chester, Illinois. Concord, South Carolina. Richmond, South Carolina. You start to see these cities popping up with the exact same names in Indiana and in Illinois, because these are these groups that are moving west and they're following, these two paths into what will eventually become free states. So the first national road is the first federally funded congressional road, and it's approved in 1806. It takes a number of years before they can raise the funds to actually start construction. So while the road is approved by Congress in 1806, it doesn't actually begin construction in Cumberland until 1811. Up until that point, again, it had been a series of short wagon roads. So they're using that trail. They're using Braddock's wagon road for part of it. Then they're starting to use those Native American trails to push further west, and they're slowly building as they go along. So you can see the route here, and you can see the progress they made. So if you're following your family's migration, and they're in Wheeling, and then they're in Columbus, and then they're in Richmond, they most likely traveled generationally along the national road. There's a lot of documentation on the national road. There's a bunch of stuff that's available, like I said, through the Library of Congress, the Ohio History Connection. So if you go to ohiohistory.org, they've got a bunch of really good information that's available on the national road. Some of it's been digitized and you can look at it already, but it really becomes that main artery for moving people who are collecting land bounties, who are turning in their scrip that they're getting from the Revolutionary War, land that they're being given from the War of 1812, and then their descendants who are being given land. It's opened up in 1832 and 1838. So then the kids and the widows can claim those bounty warrants for those soldiers in 1832 and 1838. You're starting to see those people moving into these portions of the country. An important thing to keep in mind, let me go back one slide. So as we're talking here about the national road, you see how the national road extends eventually to Alton. But if you look between the Illinois and the Mississippi rivers, there's that V in western Illinois. That was initially designated as military land, as bounty land in the state of Illinois between 1820 and 1840. So if you have people who come to Illinois and they're in those military lands, and there's a great book, Peck's Gazetteer to Illinois, 1832, I think it is, gives a really nice image of that map and designates those counties, like Alexander County, like Polk County, that were designated as military land bounty counties. So if you have family who have filed for land patents and they show up in the Bureau of Land Management database, not only did they most likely take the national road, but they most likely took it because they were given those land bounties from the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, and they're settling in between those two rivers there. So it's a really cool tie-in between people who are given their land bounties who wind up in Illinois, especially in Western Illinois, and how did they get there? This is exactly how they would have gotten there. So I'm not going to talk much about Western trails, but the two most famous trails, you've got the Oregon Trail, you've got the Santa Fe Trail. There's some amazing maps and histories available on the Yukon Trail as well, if you had people who went up to Alaska and the Gold Rush. But I just want to talk for a couple of minutes on the Oregon Trail and the Mormon Trail. They followed nearly the exact same route. The difference in the Mormon Trail was that they had traveled on the opposite side of the river. They kind of forged their own path to kind of keep their people together in safety, as they put it. But they pretty much traveled along the Platte River. So you can see the different iterations from where people would have started. And a lot of this stems from Lewis and Clark. So people who are beginning in St. Louis, who are traveling across Jefferson City, winding up at Kansas City or in St. Joseph, which is where the Pony Express is established. And they're moving west and they're following largely the North Platte River. So if they were coming across the Santa Fe Trail, they're going to start to dart south. So you see how the trail kind of dips into Denver and then picks back up again. Parts of the Mormon Trail from one time or another would go down into Fort Riley and then shoot straight up into Salt Lake City. So they wouldn't necessarily have traveled, continued to travel across the North Platte. But there's some really, really good documentation on these. So the National Park Service has an amazing map. If you want to travel a portion of this trail, you can, and they give you some great guidance there. The Legends of America has some good maps of the Oregon Trail as well. Again, Library of Congress's map collection is really top notch. If you're like me, when you were in grade school, you played on an old Apple II computer Oregon Trail, and I always died of dysentery. I don't know about the rest of you, but truly 2,200 miles. This went from the Kansas City area, because Independence, Missouri is near Kansas City, all the way up to Oregon City. So this would take a minimum of 6 months, depending on the weather. And in some instances, it could take as long as a year. We've all, heard stories about the Donner Party. We've all heard stories about people who get stuck on mountain passes and, who wind up having, to stay in their location for months at a time, traveling across the desert and, the sheer number of, cattle, and horses that would die because of the tough weather conditions. And so this is some pretty harsh terrain that they're traveling. So, if you've traveled across I-80, heading towards Denver or heading further west, you get, barely an idea as you're blazing down the highway at 80 miles an hour, what life was like for them traveling at, 6 miles a day in some instances. But what's interesting to note is the Ayers collection at the Newberry Library has a fantastic collection. So the Ayers collection is their Native American and early settler history collections. And they have some things digitized. They're available through Carly. They've got some things up in Ida. But they have some really, really fascinating first-person accounts of people who are traveling overland along the Oregon Trail or are traveling overland to California. We had several people from Plainfield who in the 1840s during the gold rush had traveled overland to California, largely following this trail. And there's a really, really good book that's been digitized, and you should be able to find it online. And it's called Overland to California. And it talks about how treacherous this trail was and about how a lot of people died along the way in Kansas and are buried in North Platte and in some of these really out of the way places just because of how hard it was to make this journey. So 400,000 people made this trek. The largest bulk of the years are going to be during the California Gold Rush, but 400,000 people made this trek, in the 40 years, in 2 generations, to just after the Civil War. A lot of people wound up staying. So once the Homestead Act is passed, in 1863, 1864, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you have a lot of people who wind up, in Kansas, in Nebraska, in the Dakotas, and that's kind of as far as they go, because this overland journey, people were going from east to west and nobody was stopping in the middle. So really the Homestead Act was designed to get people to stop in the middle, because railroads were in a huge push to get people to go west too. And I'll talk about railroads in just a couple of minutes. So people who were going overland to California, who were going for the gold rush, they're traveling that Oregon Trail and then they're diverting down into California, either at Salt Lake or at Rock Springs. Those were the 2 pushing off points between people heading north to Oregon and people who were heading south into California. So railroads are following the Oregon Trail. They're following the Santa Fe Trail. They're following the Erie Canal. Even in Joliet and in Lockport, the railroads are following the path of the I&M Canal. So like I said, that map I showed you from 1834, railroads in the U.S. were really in their infancy. You start to get your first set of railroads that are being built on the eastern seaboard in 1831. By the time you get to the 1870s, you have millions upon millions of miles of track crisscrossing the United States from coast to coast. Right after the Civil War, you have the Golden Spike that's being laid, that's uniting, the East Coast with the West Coast. And all of that is done, through the railroad companies who numbered in the hundreds in the 19th century. So how do you find them? How do you know? Why does Albion, Iowa exist when there's no longer a railroad that pushes through Albion, Iowa? And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Probably one of the best map collections you are going to find are going to be railroad map collections. Yes, you will find a lot of rivers and maps and canals. You'll find a lot of Native American trails, things on the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail, but that pales in comparison to the thousands upon thousands of railroad maps that exist for the period between 1850 and 1880. So the bulk of what you're going to find if you go to Internet Archives, if you go to HathiTrust, if you go to Google Books, are going to be between 1850 and 1880, 1885, because that's kind of the heyday of railroads in America. So railroad company newsletters, exist all the way into the 20th and 21st century, and a lot of these are digitized and available online. So the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe, I will spare you, I will not sing it. Their newsletters are digitized and available through Internet Archives. There's the the Milepost, the EJ&E. There's a huge number of those that are available digitally online as well. So once the railroad is built, you're traveling the migration of your families because you're using that railroad to get from East Coast to West Coast. But so many people worked for the railroad in comparison to people who worked on the canals or people who worked on the national road. The number of people who worked on railroads is tenfold the number of people who worked in these other building processes. So finding those employees can be equally important to your research as well. So if you wind up how somebody winds up in Topeka, Kansas, it could possibly be because they worked for the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe, or they worked for the Sioux line, or they worked for the Chicago Northwestern line, which is how they wind up in Minneapolis, St. Paul from Chicago. So you want to make sure that you're looking at railroad maps, but you also want to make sure that you're taking advantage of railroad records that are created as well. So things like those company newsletters, things like the railroad schedules and the ticket fare posters and the brochures that they put out enticing people to move west and buy land. But you also want to be looking at the types of things like the land sales. So if a railroad is going to come through a community like in Plainfield, they had to purchase the right of way for the railroad from the local farmers. So not only would the railroad company have a copy of that purchase in their records, but so would either the state archives, depending on where you're researching, or the local county recorder of deeds office or registrar, depending on the state that you're in. So it's a way to kind of track movements of people by following the purchases of the rights of way for the railroads. Looking at things like county atlases and plats are great, national railroad maps, but gazetteers. There are a lot of gazetteers that you can find digitized online. Internet Archives has several. HathiTrust has some. Family Search has a couple. And those gazetteers are like gold to your research. If you're traveling, if you're following your family who traveled during the railroad era, because those gazetteers will have page after page of schedules and times, but they're also going to tell you where the railroad cities are, where the stops are, and who the ticket agents are. So you might find out that your ancestor was a ticket agent, for, the Central Pennsylvania line. And that's why they wound up in that particular city, because they're listed as the ticket agent in that particular gazetteer that's mentioning that railroad. Talk about brochures and travel maps in just a second. But the railroads bought up hundreds of thousands of acres of land. And then once they built their route, then they were selling off the excess land that they didn't need. And they were selling it off at they were making money off of it. So they were selling it anywhere from up to 10% to 20% more than what they purchased it for. But then they were also selling it to people on rent to own, at a 10% interest per annum. So, a lot of people wound up going bankrupt because the railroads offered them these really sweet deals to buy land along the railroad, which is how the town of Albion winds up getting developed. And then a lot of them wind up losing their homes and having them foreclosed on because the interest rates were so exorbitant, and they wound up owning so much, potentially in a balloon payment or in a final payment, that they wound up losing it when their rent to own, their lease period was up. So here's a couple of those gazetteers. So the Swayze Gazetteer from 1862. What's wonderful about these gazetteers is they give you kind of the socioeconomic information about all of the towns that the railroad passes through. So we can see in Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina, it's a fine town, the capital of the Greenville district, it's on the river, has a population of 1,400. Sometimes they'll tell you the elevation. Sometimes they'll tell you how many churches there are. Sometimes they'll tell you the population, the local grade school. So sometimes they give you a lot of information that could help answer questions that you might have in your mind. In 1862, they might have had only 2 churches, a Methodist and a Baptist. So then you wonder, well, my family lived in Spartanburg at this time. They must have been either or they rented out the churches. And then you do some little investigating there. But they give you some really good information. And then the Boyd's Gazetteer from 1874, if you look on this map, you've got Alexandria in Warren County, Illinois, but you also have Albion in Marshall County, Iowa, which shows up on this map too. So it's the third one from the top, and it tells me it's on the central Iowa. If I look at Aledo in Mercer County, Illinois, it's on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. If I look at the bottom and I look at Allen in Richmond, Georgia, it's on the central Georgia line. This is priceless to your research for figuring out exactly why and how these people wind up in these towns that by 1970 are gone, have vanished, because they are following these particular railroad lines. So it's really, really cool. Like you see Alden and McHenry counties on the Chicago and Northwestern, Alden and Freeborn, Minnesota. So you see all these towns are kind of taking their same names as they're moving further and further west or further and further north. I love this map of the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe. It's available through the Library of Congress, but it's also available. The Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe has its own archives in Topeka. And what's cool about this map is not only does it show you all of its branches, it shows you its route. It pretty much followed, mile for mile, the Santa Fe Trail down into Santa Fe and into New Mexico. But it also shows me the name of each and every station agent and where they lived or where the station was. So this is really, really cool, especially if your ancestor is W.F. White, who was the ticket agent in Topeka, Kansas. So fantastic railroad map collections that could really help illustrate why and how your family wound up in one particular place or another. It really is the most robust of all of the collections that I've talked about. Like I said, they were trying to push people to buy lands. The Homestead Act, was really, really popular, but there were plenty of people who did not qualify for land under the Homestead Act. You had to be an American citizen. When in very, very early years of the Homestead Act, you could not have raised arms against the U.S. government, which means no Confederates. So a lot of railroad companies are selling land at what they call, fantastic rates to people who might not have qualified for homestead land. They're selling them side by side with people who are claiming homestead lands as well. And you can see that they're selling them on credit. They're leasing them to people for 10-year loans, typically with huge balloon payments at the end, forcing a lot of people off their land at the end. So there's some great resources out there to kind of get to the bottom of some of these sad tales as well. They also put out a lot of fun illustrated maps to kind of entice people to just travel on vacation. So really the railroad era opened up travel just for fun. Up until this point, if you were moving for a reason. If you're going to cross this treacherous journey to get on the Oregon Trail or to get along the Santa Fe Trail, you weren't doing it just for a good time. The railroads really changed all of that. So if you have ever looked at Galbraith's railway maps, they're fascinating, they're fun. They're all hand-drawn, illustrated to entice people to travel to certain places. So I kind of show you a snapshot of the Illinois map and the Iowa map. You've got Balltown, you've got Morris, Samuel, an illustration of Samuel Morris there. You've got a little fox for the town of Fox and the Fox River. Just some fun illustrations to kind of entice people to travel and utilize the railroads. So, like I said, everything speeds up. So people go from wagon routes to canals to railroads to then automobiles. So the Lincoln Highway was really a game changer in a couple of different ways, and it kind of paved the way, so to speak, for Route 66 and other national highways, thanks to Eisenhower in the 1950s and the Highway Act. But what was unique about the Lincoln Highway is the fact that it was a coast-to-coast highway that was built on roads largely that already exist. So there are 3 incarnations of the Lincoln Highway that pass through Illinois. I live in Oswego and I work in Plainfield, so I drive over 2 of those different routes every time I go to work. So the initial routes connected cities based on dirt or gravel roads that already existed. That was the original route. It wasn't until after 1915, between 1918 and 1923, that U.S. Route 30 became the second iteration of that route. And that's where they kind of shaved off some of those farm routes, all those crazy, ebbs and flows and turns to make a more direct route. So normally if people were traveling across Illinois to Omaha, for example, they would have traveled along Iowa Route 2 in southern Iowa. The Lincoln Highway changed all of that. And if you've ever driven US Route 30 through Iowa, that is the route. That's the Lincoln Highway. That was the route that was created. US Route 30 was created between 1918 and 1923. So they kind of changed the course and smoothed it out a little. But it stretched from downtown Manhattan to Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. It was a huge travel route for supplies of the U.S. Army during the First World War. They did a caravan, and they just did that anniversary of the caravan last year in 1919. They did it for the 100th anniversary in 2019, where they recreated that route. And Army trucks, drove through Naperville and Plainfield, if you remember last year. So this was a very big deal, because up until this point, people really couldn't travel far outside of their communities because there wasn't a way to connect communities together. So we would have a road that might go from Joliet to Plainfield, but we might not have had a route that was going to take us from Plainfield to Morris, or a route that was going to take us from, Plainfield to Bristol. So, the Lincoln Highway really kind of connected all of these cities coast to coast to allow people to travel for pleasure, to travel for leisure. And the Lincoln Highway really advertised and catered to women. So if you look at Lincoln Highway guides from the 1920s, and there are a lot of them online, you can find them on Internet Archives and Google Books, they really advertised safe, well-lit places for women to rest, for women to use the restrooms, and for women to eat. They really, really pushed the safety of the Lincoln Highway to female travelers. So it's fascinating to read about this early history. So like I said, there were 3 alignments. You can see those by going through either the Illinois Lincoln Highway Association or the National Lincoln Highway Association to see those maps. But think about how the Lincoln Highway really spurred road construction in Illinois alone. So a lot of these routes don't really exist as we would see them on this map from Rand McNally in 1922. But if you look between Joliet and Chicago, you'll see Route 4 and Route 4A. That's what becomes Route 66. I talked about Route 2, the Lone Star Route 2, that what we would think of as Route 6 now. That's going from Joliet to Ottawa down towards Starved Rock. So even though the numbers and the names of these might have changed, a lot of these roads still exist in either county highway designations or in national highway designations. So Route 22 becomes US Route 30. I talk about the Lincoln Highway and I talk about those 3 different reiterations. This map in red shows you the 3 different routes of the Lincoln Highway over time. So US Highway 30, eventually cuts straight down, but you can see how it zigged and zagged between Aurora, 4th Street and Smith in Aurora, which is I think where the very last Lincoln Highway stanchion with the penny still stands. You can see how it zigs and zags until it gets to Plainfield. And then US Route 30 cuts across into downtown Joliet. It really gives you an idea of how it changes over time. Again, Route 66 kind of picks up the mantle when Lincoln Highway dies down. So in the 1930s, the Lincoln Highway has kind of petered out and is lost to history for a long time until it has a resurgence in the 1990s. Route 66 begins in 1926 and kind of steals that thunder from the Lincoln Highway because it is a smoother, a slicker route to get from Illinois, to get from Chicago, all the way to LA. So while the old route went from Manhattan to San Francisco and it took a northerly route, this one's unique because it kind of heads south through Oklahoma City. I'm not going to sing that song to you either, Kingston, Barstow, San Bernardino. But it's the route that people traveled during the Great Depression. It peters out also right about the time of the Second World War. And it really just becomes, in the 1940s and the 1950s, kind of a leisurely route to get people back and forth between LA and Chicago. Like I said, the Highway Act in 1952 really changes all of that because all of this is now bypassed by US 10, by I-80, by US Route 40, by I-95, stuff like that. Really kind of was the death knell to both the Lincoln Highway and to Route 66. But there's some great history that's out there. The National Route 66 organization, Historic Route 66. There are some great places. The Joliet History Museum has some great information about traveling along Route 66 as well. So in modern times, people were still doing it. They just weren't necessarily using it to travel. So I'm going to let this map run for a minute because I want you to take a look at it. It's a fascinating map, and it kind of explains how populations settle by nationality across the country. So I'll let it run through 2 times so you can see how communities, Czech, Dutch, French, English, German, how they're settling across the country. And you have this link in your handout so you can go and take a look at this map yourself. It's provided by the US Census Bureau, but they're basing it on statistics that are provided through the National Archives. So it's all of the things that showed up in US Census data from 1790 to 1950. So they're showing you, look at all the Irish, look at all the German, that show up across the country. And as they move, how are they getting to northern Minnesota? How are they getting, to southern Oklahoma? What routes are they taking to get to those places? But this is a great map to kind of illustrate where and how nationalities are settling across the United States.